Karl Marx's writings on alienation. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you, Michael, for being, as always, such a great organizer. And it's a pleasure to be here with Michael Hardt. He has been very kind with me. I'm very grateful that he will be discussing this anthology, Karl Marx writing just published with Paul. There are a few comrades that I believe have the microphone on. And I don't know, Michael, perhaps we can ask them to...
I'll go through the room and mute people.
Yeah, H-Mean just unmuted himself or herself. A few other things, like Lynn, can you turn off the microphone, please? Because every time that you... Michael, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to take, as agreed, not more than 20 minutes, because I am interested in discussing with Michael Hardt, and of course, receiving comments and questions, Michael Hardt and I, from the audience. So we know that the theory of alienation has been something extremely significant in at least the 20th century. This is one point that we are going to discuss today, that the theory of alienation occupies a significant place in the work of Marx, or perhaps in the interpretation of Marx, in a certain interpretation of Marx. But the reason why I decided to organize, to edit this introduction, this anthology, is because I believe that very often, too often, the interpretation of alienation in Marx is erroneously based on his early writings, and in particular is erroneously based on the 1844 manuscripts. I believe that the most relevant pages of Marx on alienation are to be found in his later economic work, where you will deal with a far more extensive detailed interpretation of the concept of alienation in all these different take, but we will go to this later. So I don't know if you remember, I'm sure that many of you have seen this wonderful movie. I believe it's from the end of the 80s, with Robin Williams. The title of this movie was Dead Poet Society. So Robin Williams is the teacher, Captain My Captain, and is in the first revolutionary, shocking scene. Mary Larson, please turn off the microphone, of the movie. Robin Williams, the teacher of this school, asked the students to tear off the entire introduction. And they were shocked because, they come from this very traditional and conservative things, and it's impossible, untouchable, to touch a book. In this introduction, there would be like, the consensus, the basic ideas about poetry. I would like to do the same, and in a sort of way, I've done the same because I decided to publish an anthology in which I didn't tear off the entire introduction, but I just left a few pages, a few essential points from the economical philosophical manuscript of 1844. So I just had less than 3,000 words coming from this book. On the contrary, most of my anthology deals with the Grundrisse. That is, in my opinion, an essential work also from the point of view of the introduction in Marx. It's not an essential work because Marx has his final thought about any of his major ideas, but because it's a fundamental bridge and it's the beginning of the writing of his critique of political economy. There is a lot from the manuscript from 61-63 that is the second draft of Capital, and then of the theory of surplus value that Marx wrote between the end of 62 and 63. I've taken more than 10,000 words from this, and then of course there is a lot from Capital, particularly from the unpublished chapter 6 of Capital. So later I will return to this because it is essential to notice that Marx is still writing and dealing with the concept of alienation, even though alienation is a big umbrella under which there are many different ideas later in his life. As all of us, almost all of us, but I must say this for the young people in the audience, the first systematic philosophical account of alienation is something to be found in Hegel, in the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. And there you will find the conceptualization Entäußerung and Fremdung, like, renunciation, self-externalization, the meaning of Entäußerung, and perhaps estrangement, the correct translation for Entfremdung. So they denote spirit becoming other than itself in the realm of objectivity. But as we know, with this wonderful, brilliant text written by Marx when he was only 26 years old, the economical philosophical manuscript of 1844, the problem of alienation moves from the philosophical sphere, religious sphere, political sphere into the realm of production, material production. So Marx is writing for the first time, joining together Hegel and Adam Smith, philosophy and political economy. And for Marx, not only, and I'm reading from the EPM of 1844, that is, labor becomes an object, an external existence, but it is also existing independently as something alien to the worker, becomes a power on his own, confronting him or her, the life which he or she has conferred to the object, confront her or him as something hostile and alien. And from here, we know the famous 4 ways of alienation from the product, in the working activity, from man, species, being, and from other human beings that Marx indicates in the EPM of 1844. So after this very general and basic coordinates that might also be useful for our discussion later, what I'm going to do in the remaining 10 minutes of my introduction will be to analyze the debate on the concept of alienation in Marx's early writings. Because despite the fact that I tear off the introduction and I just left 3,000 words in this anthology from this text, I would like to start the first part of my presentation by saying why this text was so important and what were the different school of thoughts about alienation in the early writings. So, first of all, we should go back to World War II, to the atmosphere after World War II, to the atmosphere resulting from barbarities of Nazism and fascism in Europe in late 40s, in early 50s, when the economical philosophical writing manuscript of 1844 started to circulate. Because it is true that they were written in 1844, but they were just published in 1932, few months after Hitler took the power in Germany, and therefore the possibility for this manuscript to this text, to this book, not to circulate. So we have to wait for like 15 more years for the economical philosophical manuscript to circulate, and then a few more years for countries like Italy, France, where Marxism was very significant, with the communist tradition, to be translated. The English translation comes even after that. But in this period, beginning of the 50s, from the beginning of the 50s, there are these interpretations of this text. This is a text that is changing the general interpretation of Marx. It is not coming alone, because this text was also published at the same time, 100 years after the writing of Marx, from 1840s to 1930s, together with the German ideology, together with the critique of Hegel philosophy of right. And we must also say that in this 100 years, we can use the metaphor of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 years of solitude. Well, nobody, or very, very few brilliant minds, one of them is Isaac Rubin, one other is Georgi Lukács, they were able to discover the relevance of alienation in Marx. So the interpretation of Marx, the Marxist debate, the political debate, is not focusing on alienation. With the circulation of this text, 1844, there is a strong revolution, a big change. As Henri Lefebvre put it, their assimilation was the decisive philosophical event of the period. So this is not only something that is relevant for the interpretation of Marx. This is something that is changing dramatically philosophy in Europe, political philosophy in Europe, in countries like Italy, France, Germany, and then later, of course, in other parts. Also in Eastern Europe, but I have to introduce the position of Soviet Union before talking about this. So there are two quotations that I always use in order to express the different approaches to just how to look at this problematic, just how to look at this manuscript. The first one is from Louis Althusser, one of the protagonists of this season and also of the interpretation of this manuscript. Althusser wrote, "Any discussion of Marx's early works is a political discussion. Need we be reminded that Marx's early works were exhumed by social democrats and exploited by them to the detriment of Marxism-Leninism?" So for Althusser, the discussion is the young Marx. What is at stake is Marxism. And as he wrote, the terms of discussion are whether the young Marx was already wholly Marx, the full Marx. The other point of view is, for me, very well expressed by an author that is not as famous as Louis Althusser. His name is Irving Fetcher. Let's say that more or less belongs to the tradition around Frankfurt School, but very well known, very respected in Germany. Fetcher said, "The early writings of Marx center so strongly on the liberation of men from every form of exploitation, domination, alienation, that the Soviet reader must have understood these comments as a criticism of his own situation under Stalinist domination." So for Althusser, the problem is making Marxism more moderate with this concept of alienation. Fetcher is, on the contrary, calling our attention on the fact that there is so much alienation in actually existing socialism that this text is seen as a sort of, danger for Soviet Union, for the, dogmatic interpretation of Soviet Union. And therefore, from now on, there will be three different interpretations. And I'm going to talk about them very quickly before leaving the floor to Michael Hardt. The first interpretation of the concept of alienation in 18 philosophical manuscript of 1844 is the interpretation of those who believe that there is a theoretical preeminence of this writing on all the rest, including capital. The second interpretation is made by the different interpretation, as we will see later, Althusser, Soviet Union, etc., who gave little significance to the concept of alienation in the 1844 manuscript. And then, as you can imagine, those of you familiar with the debate on Marx, the third trend was the trend of the theoretical continuum between the early writings and capital, the alienation in Marx, in the young Marx, and the so-called major Marx. So let's read, with few quotations that I've selected for you, what were arguing people belonging to the first interpretation. 1844, more interesting, preeminence of 1844 on capital, on the critique of political economy. The editor of this text, the Social Democrats Landshut and Meyer, they talk about they interpreted Marx economics writing as a step back from what they saw as the centrality of human person in its early theories. So from this moment, there is a significant current, a significant interpretation of Marx that is growing consensus, that is telling us that actually the most interesting Marx, the Marx that at the center of his theoretical project, humanism, is the young Marx, is the Marx who still had a lot of philosophy in his, or a lot of books, many books of philosophies on his table. And Landshut and Meyer wrote in the introduction, because the EPM of 1844 came out at the same time with two different editions, one in Germany and one in Soviet Union, one edited with this interpretation and one with another introduction. And of course, two different editions, because these are fragmentary and very complicated manuscript written by Marx not to be published in that form. They said, Landshut and Meyer, in essence already anticipated capital. The 18 manuscript of 1844 anticipated capital, and they wrote, actually there is no fundamentally new idea after that. You know, for any of us who have read Capital, you will look at this like a big provocation, because it seems that Marx has later, lost without any reason 23 years before publishing Capital in 1867. Who are the main sponsors of this interpretation? You will find many heterodox Marxists who had this idea in order to fight, to go against Soviet Union as much as they could. You will find many progressive Christians, like people like Bigot, Calvet from Jesuit school, at the time where Marxism was also debating with these political tendencies. So theological Marx, philosophical Marx, and speaking of this, of course, existentialism, right? So Merleau-Ponty, and many other people, including Fromm in the United States, Axelos, and many others. In order to close this part, I would like to say that the manuscript of 1844 were considered Marx's main philosophical work, and these people were arguing that the concept of alienation was and remained the focal point in the thinking of the young Marx and the old Marx who wrote Capital. But it is better developed in the 1844 manuscript. The French sociologist and non-Marxist, or perhaps anti-communist, like Raymond Aron, made fun of this kind of interpretation in a very good book that was called Imaginary Marxism, published in 1969. He's talking about the fact that many people on la rive gauche de la Seine in Paris, they were excited by the obscurity, the incompleteness, and sometimes contradictory character. So this was a source of fascination from these people. To read a quotation, 20 years ago, Latin Quarter orthodoxy regarded the manuscript of 1844 as the last word in Marxist theory, even though, if one sticks to the text, Marx himself ridiculed the language and types of analysis that he adopted in his early works. So if this first point is clear, I'm going to go to the second one, the second interpretation, the interpretation that was made for the first time in Soviet Union by Adoraski in the preface from the 1932 edition of the Russian edition of the APM of 1844. In this introduction, you read that there was a failure in this manuscript to mention, not to mention actually, dictatorship of the proletariat. And from this, you can see that there is not yet an idea, developed idea of Marxism, Leninism. And by the way, this manuscript were excluded from the editions of the works of Marx and Engels. They were published very, very late. They were not published at all until the late 70s or early 80s in some countries of the socialist bloc, and they were never published in large edition, paperback edition, like all of other Marx texts were published, including the unfinished manuscript of Marx, because the objection is not that this was an unfinished text. The German ideology is the same. The critique of Hegel of 1843, the same, not talking about volume 2, volume 3 of Capital, the Grundrisse, etc., etc. So the most relevant author who supported this interpretation is Althusser. Actually, Althusser is also following Pierre Naville, Le Nouveau Léviathan, but the important thing is that with Althusser, we have one of the most relevant Marxists in the world who was saying this, and Althusser, I'm quoting from his book, For Marx, there is, the famous concepts coming here, an epistemological break that divides Marx thought into two long essential periods: the ideological period before and the scientific period after the break. Althusser located the break in 1845, few months after the writings of the manuscript, the Parisian manuscript. So the EPM of 1844 represented from Althusser, please pay attention to this, the Marx most distant from Marxism, the Marx that is hesitating the night before turning into Marxism. And a quotation was always particularly interesting for me. I would like to read it for you. If you look at the whole of Marx's work, there is no doubt that there does exist a break of some kind in 1845. Marx says so himself. The whole work of Marx shows him to be right on this point. The epistemological break is a point of no return. It is true that Marx several times uses the term alienation, but all that disappears in Marx's later texts and in Lenin completely. Like Lenin is provided as a proof that Marx was not enough Marxist. And actually, we also know very well today that Althusser ignored the Grundrisse. Althusser has not read the Grundrisse. Althusser knew very well the introduction of 1857 that has a completely different history from the entire big manuscript of the Grundrisse. But as he declared to Lucien Sèvres, he was not a scholar and perhaps has never very carefully read the Grundrisse. So Althusser was wrong. Marx never wrote of or hinted at the presence of a break or an epistemological break. And the fact that he invoked Lenin as a failure to mention alienation is, of course, not a proof to this. The point is not to deny that Marx thought underwent huge changes, because, of course, I support this interpretation, but to contest Althusser's theorization of a rigid break according to which the EPM of 1844 and other early writings can be considered extraneous to Marxism rather than an integral part of his development. And these two positions, the first position, alienation in 1834 is more important, is more relevant than capital. And Marx in 1844, the critique of alienation of 1844 is not Marxist yet. I believe that both of them contributed to one of the biggest misunderstanding in the history of Marxism, the creation of a myth, the myth of the young Marx. So they consistently created one of the principal problem in the history of Marxism. And I will now go to a third interpretation that is, let's say, my party, the interpretation that I share. But even in this interpretation, I see many problems and some mistakes that I would like to call to your attention, and then, of course, discuss with Michael Hardt. I'm done in 2 minutes, and with all of you. This interpretation says that there is, as I said at the beginning, a substantive continuity in Marx's work. But when I read very carefully this interpretation, this text, I saw that there were some dangers and problems in at least 80% of the books supporting this interpretation. I would like to make a few examples. Maximilien Rouvel was being one of the most important Marxologists of the 20th century. He wrote that the 1844 manuscript anticipated the central thesis of Capital. And he saw an evident basic identity between Marx's position in his first critique of private property and his later analysis of capitalist economy. We cannot avoid to reject all these ideas. So the idea that you already find developed or well-developed or anticipated in its entirety the thesis of Capital, the main thesis of Capital in this manuscript written by the very young Marx. The famous sociologist Robert Tucker, he wrote a continuity of Marx's thought from the early writings to Capital and a centrality of the alienation theme throughout. So this interpretation is something that can be found in David McNellan. The early writings contain all the subsequent themes of Marx thought and show them in the making, and also in the most important book written on this topic in the 60s, in the 70s, in the golden age of Marxism. I'm talking about Bertel Ollman, Alienation, that was sold perhaps in 35,000, 40,000 copies, Alienation, published in 1971. Bertel wrote, I do not emphasize alteration in Marx thinking because I do not see many there, especially when compared to the essential unity in Marxism from 1844 on. Even in the published version of Capital, there is much more of Marx's earlier ideas and concept than is generally recognized. There is one problem here that I would like to pose to your attention. Many of the authors who did this kind of interpretations were philosophers, and many of these authors had a very weak understanding or a lazy use of Capital, of the 3 volumes of Capital, or of this very big odyssey that means writing Capital from the Grundrisse 1857 up to the final manuscript that now we can read with Marx Engelske Samtalsgabe with the new edition in 1882. So there were a couple of good interpretations, like Istvan Metzaros. He wrote, the rejection of the young Marx versus mature Marx dichotomy does not mean the denial of Marx's intellectual development. So if we say that there is no epistemological break, at the same time, we should not do the big mistake of not understanding the incredible path that Marx has done in these 2.5 decades. And always from Metzaros, all further concretization and modification of Marx's conception, including some major discoveries of the old Marx, are realized on the conceptual basis of the great philosophical achievement that we had in the manuscript of 1844. But still they are very different. Adam Schaff, the Polish scholar who wrote more than anybody else in the actually existing socialism block, he wrote, an embryo even of the concept of commodity fetishism is to be found in EPM of 1844. But I believe that conceptions like the one that we see in books like The Critique of Everyday Life of Lefebvre, where he wrote, in the 1844 manuscript, Marx had not yet fully developed his thought. It is there, however, germinating, growing, becoming, and there is not a next moment that Marx becomes Marxist and there is this epistemological break. So the suggestion made by Lefebvre is that the mistake, the first option, which must be avoided, is to overestimate and also to underestimate Marx's early writings. I have other quotation here from other authors, but I will stop here because I want to say that what I tried to do in this book was focus as much as possible without underestimating and overestimating on the Marx of 1844, this deeper understanding of alienation that Marx is able to do only when he is more aware of the socio-economic dynamics of capitalism. And this can happen only after the studies that he conducted in the 50s and in the 60s. Thanks to all of you, and Michael, all for you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Well, thanks to Michael for organizing this, and I'm very happy to be here. Thanks too to Marcello, not only for this excellent volume, but for extraordinary range of original writing and editorial work, of which this is part. I have some questions about, and I wanted to really mount a discussion with Marcello about certain points that that this volume stimulates for me. Yeah, I think that's the right way of putting it. I mean, I should say first that I teach a I've taught for the last 25-ish years, I suppose, every spring, a course on Marx's writings for undergraduate students, university students, and it's definitely true that for a large percentage of them, the concept of alienation is the high point of reading Marx. I mean, it's the thing that appeals to them and draws them the most. And so it's certainly worth our focus in that regard. And but what I wanted to start with, I guess one thing that Marcello does wonderfully in this, with the both with his introductory essay and then with the various selections, is demonstrate Marx's use of the concept, even when the actual word isn't there, of alienation throughout his work. For instance, of labor that appears to us as external and menacing or threatening, or any number of other comments. So things in some ways that we found in that original description in the 1844 manuscripts that then come in different forms. And I guess that one of the things that I'm trying to figure out what my position about it is, and this is what the different things I want to ask Marcello about are really part of this, is whether it's the same concept of alienation that we find throughout, or if there is something fundamentally different that changes in it. Of course, Marcello, you said that there's an evolution of Marxist thought, and we should all recognize that, and that's, of course, certainly right. Maybe I'll get little by little, or come to in a second, my core questions. But I wanted to start, actually, and this might be a bit selfish, asking Marcello a specific textual question. And that is that, and this is something I don't know, and I've had my assumptions about, but I'm kind of think that you might know, and if of course you don't, then we'll just leave it go. But in the second, if Marx's preface to the second edition of Capital, and so in our English edition, the vintage edition, it's on page 94. It's the very first page of it. He says that when he was visiting Kugelmann after Capital had been Kugelmann convinced him that most readers needed a supplementary, more didactic exposition of the form of value, essentially of part one of the book. And so he says the last section of the first chapter, the fetishism of commodities, etc., has been altered considerably. And so altered considerably to give readers a supplementary, more didactic exposition of the form of value. I guess I was assuming, this is my assumption, it relates to alienation in this way, that he added something that he thought would appeal to readers' imagination and even moral outrage, that the dry exposition of use value, exchange value, surplus value eventually didn't get. And that's when, in some sense, he revived, he brings back in the question, as you point out very well, that the notion of fetishism reification is very close to the alienation discourse. But before we get to the actual substance of that, do you think do you have any, because you, much more than I, read all of the different drafts and manuscripts, when he says that he revised that section to be more didactic, do you think it is the greater introduction of exactly the kinds of texts that you're focusing on here?
Do you want me to respond now, or do you want me to respond in the end, Michael? Do you want to?
Okay, maybe I'll go on, and then you could respond and make me.
As you prefer.
Maybe that does more sense. Okay, so that's just a purely textual thing, but maybe it'll become clear. I guess because one of the things that I wonder with the different times that the alienation argument comes up in later works, I wonder if this comes up at moments when he wants to, I don't know if the right term is tug at the heartstrings of the reader or create a moral argument. In some ways, I find this, I do think that the alienation argument relies on a moral claim and a moral outrage. And so that's what I'm My other questions in some ways are relating to that. Like even when it's not mentioned, I consider these moments, these are related, I think, to the ones you pick out. So they're not directly alienation, but moments in the text in Capital, I'm thinking volume 1 even, where he poses the moral outrage at the inversion of subject and object. So you'll remember, for instance, in chapter 15, too, on the factory, when he's talking about machines, there too, even though it's not a question of alienation, in handicrafts and even in manufacturing, a worker used a tool, but in the large scale industry, the machine uses the worker. There's inversion of subject and object, and I feel like the same point is reached. I guess maybe I'm trying to express that I have assumed previously, and I think you're challenging this in a really good way, that these moments of moral outrage at the inversion of subject and object feel to me supplementary to the argument. But I think you're arguing that they should be internal to it. So that's what so maybe that's one question maybe about the arc of that you're tracing of alienation across the decades of his work is, I guess I have two questions about it. One is, and I'm going to come back to this first one in a minute. My first question is alienation the same thing in these? And now I want to ask in a minute what that would mean. The second one, which I sort of posed already, which is that when it appears in the later works, is it a rhetorical supplement, or is it the core of the argument? That's because, and I'm asking it in pure, whatever you call it, self-critical mode, that I have been influenced by many of the authors that you pointed to think of it as a supplement, and I think you're arguing it for it being core to the argument, and that seems to me a very interesting point, which maybe just requires you to re-elaborate or further elaborate some of your point. So the next one about is it something different? Like the other question I have, or rather, I should put it this way, rather than a question, it's the previous way I was thinking of it before reading your collection. So that's what I'm not yet, I want you still to convince me more, which is, is it the same thing when we get alienation later on as we had in the beginning? So here I am quite influenced by Althusser, but I would add a bit to what I understand Althusser's position on this. First of all, I would say one has to ask, what is anti-humanism? Insofar as Althusser's position about this has to do with anti-humanism. And I think my reading of Althusser's anti-humanism, and I think this is Althusser's too, comes directly from Spinoza, as things often do for Althusser. At the beginning, I'm sorry to be textual about these things. You can ignore my references and just take the meat of it. But it is at the beginning of part 3 of Spinoza's Ethics, a famous line that Althusser was quite tied to when Spinoza says, what does he say? He says, most people who have written about the emotions and human conduct, the affects, seem to be dealing not with a natural phenomena that follows the common laws of nature, but with phenomena outside nature. They appear to go so far as to conceive man in nature as a kingdom within a kingdom. Imperium in imperio. That's the title. And so humanism, the humanism that Althusser following Spinoza is attacking, is the one that assumes a human nature which is separate from nature as a whole. And so that is the question then about that I was assuming about the 1844 notion of alienation, which is that notion of alienation is assuming a human nature, and specifically a human nature that's separate from nature as a whole, that doesn't obey the same laws as nature as a whole. And I guess I've read that into it because I assume what humans are alienated from, because one must always be alienated from something. We are alienated from a nature, a human nature, perhaps that has never been realized, of course, but that could with a struggle against capital, with the overthrow of capital, and the overthrow of alienation, a nature that we could finally discover. it seems to me, if that were the case, if the alienation of the 1844 manuscripts were a humanism in Althusser's sense, meaning assuming a human nature that is separate from nature as a whole, I think if that were true, I do think that the later Marx does not rely on a conception of human nature, to which we could. Yeah, it's not. I mean, he always, in the manuscripts, especially, he always uses the notion of return, but it's a return to a place we've never been. So it's to achieve a position of the supersession of private property, of something like that. And I guess I do when in the 1850s in the Grundrisse, in the 1860s in Volume 1. I do read the passages you're writing, either as two, so either of my two arguments going, that either they are moments of a kind of supplement of moral outrage that he's bringing into the argument, but is really not the core of the argument. And, I was going to say or I'm not sure exactly which, that the notion of alienation here, I'm recognizing it, and you're wonderful for bringing up the continuity of formulations, does not assume a concept of human nature the way that the way I'm assuming, and I've been brainwashed by Althusser, I'll admit it, like many of us have, but I'm influenced by him. That's all I want to say. In thinking that perhaps this is something different. That's enough to start, Marcello, and then maybe we'll be able to actually have a real conversation. It's always hard in these formats to actually really speak to each other. But please try. And I hope I was clear enough in what I was saying.
Yes, Michael, you were, and it's always very interesting reading you or listening to you. I will just focus on the, let's say, more debatable parts or problematic parts, and take like very useful complements the other things that you said from the main argument that I was trying to construct, just because I had a few more minutes than you. So the first question, let's say the textual, the philological question, about the alteration of capital. Yes, the 1867 edition, the first manuscript of Capital, the pages that Marx had in his bag when he took the train from London to Hamburg in 1867, and he spent a little bit of time with his friend, Dr. Kugelmann, was a terrible organization of the text. Kugelmann didn't like it. Engels hated it. If you read the correspondence between Marx and Engels, perhaps these are some of the most critical pages in their correspondence, because Engels said, I cannot believe that after all the work that you have done, and we should remember that Marx has been torturing Engels for a couple of decades, with the argument that Marx was like an artist, and therefore there is always this things of assimilating Marx to the painter famous in this history of Balzac, right? The painter that is always trying to improve his masterpiece until the moment that he destroys and the masterpiece, his work. And Marx said, I cannot publish anything of my work if I do not have the entire work in front of me, which would have meant that Marx would have never published not even volume 2 and 3, but also volume 1. So Engels was able to convince him after Marx promised him, it's ready, I have the manuscript, it is here, just starting from late 40s. So Marx is, in my opinion, Michael, reorganizing the work, because actually there were no subsections. There were just chapter 1, chapter 2 until 7, and it was very difficult to read this edition. Engels said, you're doing like Hegel, so you should help the reader, as Marx also did in the famous preface to the French edition, right? That if you want to learn science, well, you have to be prepared to suffer a little bit. And I do not think that there is a change in the matter of what Marx wanted to write, but there is a change in the exposition and in the organization of the arguments of Marx. And you know, Michael, why I'm convinced about this? I'm convinced about this because I find 15,000 words focused on alienation, or more or less on this thematic that can be brought under this big umbrella on alienation, that Marx wrote in the 60s, or actually even few months before writing the final version of Capital in the so-called chapter 6 unpublished. There is a lot, it's significant, it cannot be ignored. So I don't think that Marx is including this just because he wanted to make the reader, to give some breadth to the readers, right, in these three complicated chapters. But I believe that there is a better organization of the materials, which is something that Marx is continuing to doing also with the French translation that he co-translated 72, 75, and also with the second German edition 1872, and until the end of his life. So when Marx is going to Algiers at the very end of his life, he's trying to do this because he wants some time not to write volume 2, that is impossible for his health, for his strength at the time, but at least to reorganize a little bit better volume 1. So first point, I don't think that there is a change because of this. I think there is a change in the organization. The second question, is there a moral claim, as Michael told us? In my opinion, here we have, and you said an inversion of subject and object. I would say that this, and I will try to put together, otherwise I'm taking too much time and I want to go back to you and perhaps also to other people who want to ask questions to you, Michael. I'm going to merge these two questions. And the second question is, in later Marx, correct me if I'm wrong, alienation is a rhetorical supplement or there is a new significant part that is there? So I want to say something. I want to put a message in the bottle. If there is somebody out there interested, we can talk a little bit more about this. There is a question about self-alienation, and there is a use that this idea of self-alienation, that is self-estrangement, etc. So one of the 4 points of 1844 manuscript that has been used later by a certain interpretation of Marx in order to take alienation away from what it actually is from Marx, away from the real characteristic of Marx that I said is bringing alienation to the material production, to political economy, to the life of human beings, to workers. And if you look at psychology, if you look at mainstream sociology, if you look at many philosophers, so there is this idea of humanism that I do not like when it's organized in this way, just like Michael doesn't like it. And this is something that is very different from Marx, right? So there is this significant difference with 1844. And by the way, this interpretation is stressing one of the 4 aspects, basic being, all this discourse, etc. But in my opinion, what I call in this introduction, the second generation of writings on alienation, because in my opinion, it is really a new generation of writings, like, not only because it's something that comes out in the 70s, because the Grundrisse started to circulate in English in 1973, and even after that, the other drafts of Capital, etc. But because I believe that there is a greater understanding of economic categories and a more rigorous social analysis. So there is a difference, and I will not say that there is only a moral claim. I see some more moral claim in the early writings that is also coming from, early socialists, right? It is also something that can be very easily found in the Holy Family, in the German ideology, in all this formulation about communism. When Marx is writing about alienation in the Grundrisse and in other preparatory drafts of Capital, usually there are often quotations about what communism will be after he's criticizing capitalist society. So like Marx is not able to stop. And in my opinion, I would like to read a couple of quotations. I think that Michael Hardt liked many of them as much as I do. In the Grundrisse, Marx wrote that in the communist society, production would be directly social, the offspring of association which distributes labor internally. It would be managed, this is me writing, by individuals as their common wealth. Marx quotation, the social character of production will make the product into a communal general product from the outset. Its associative character would be presupposed, and the labor of the individual is taken from the outset as social labor. So, in my opinion, in these writings, Marx has understood capitalist society better, and Marx is able to supplement, after he changed this concept that he wrote in the 40s, without dramatically, transforming what he taught then and the brilliant ideas that he had then, but of course, being able to enrich this concept with all the understanding and the rigorous analysis that he had done in this, 23 years. Otherwise, as Raymond Aron was writing, then Marx would have published this already in the 40s, and there would be not the significant and strong support that his critique of political economy is providing to us. Back to Michael, and then back to the audience. Did I convince you a little bit more, or you tell me? Or I said something bad that...
No, I can see that we are... that in many ways we're on the same line. I mean, because for you too, it's important that there is an evolution in his thinking. Whether that be a break or not, that's what I'm wondering. But one of the things you made me think as you were speaking, question that I didn't quite formulate before is whether there's an important difference between understanding, like if perhaps your argument would lead some to understand that communism should be understood as creating an unalienated life or an unalienated society, something like that. And I was wondering if there's a difference between that, or if it's perfectly coherent with something like, here I'm at the very end of chapter 33, I believe, in volume 1. No, it's 32. It's the very short chapter where he gives a negation of the negation type thing, and he arrives there at, let's see, it doesn't reestablish private property, but the movement towards communism, it's on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself. So yeah, cooperation, possession in common of the land, and possession in common of the means of production. I have seen that as a very different notion of what, or it even have different political implications of thinking of the movement from capitalism to communism that way, achievements of the capitalist era, cooperation, the kinds of possession in common that capital, in fact, gives a stepping stone towards, something like that. And then unalienation or an unalienated society has seemed to be different. But I wouldn't be surprised if you could convince me that I shouldn't see them so differently, that I should see the movement against alienation as compatible or another face of this same movement I'm talking about. I hope I'm not being too telegrammatic with the reference to volume 1. I mean, maybe it sounds familiar to everyone, that those achievements of the capitalist era. Michael at least is shaking his head, so I can count on you to, I don't need to say more about that for you. Marcello, maybe just briefly to you, and then we can open up to other people.
Yes, really very briefly, because we are in agreement, and actually you were very convincing in saying this. Understanding communism as a non-alienated society, and then of course there are many other issues and many other questions, right, that we must consider when we try to reconstruct Marx's conception of post-capitalist society, which, by the way, will be the topic of my talk with John Bellamy Foster on May the 7th. And also Michael Hardt has written very interesting things on this. I would say that Marx wrote in the Grundrisse, free development under the domination of capital was the most sweeping abolition of all individual freedom and the complete subjugation of individuality to social conditions which assume the form of objective powers, indeed of overpowering objects independent of individual relating to one another. So this is brilliant in my idea. I see that there is some link and connection with what Marx was able to develop, and Marx was able to bring from the critique of religion and the critique of philosophy to the sphere of political economy. But at the same time, there is more, and there is more that is also related to cooperation, that is also related to a planned organization of society. And then, of course, there is the idea that I see in many of this manuscript that the end of alienation is not the end of history. That is not that socialism is solving this question. And this is also something that is cleaning many wrong interpretation of Marx. This is why perhaps this concept was considered so dangerous from many, let's say, communist states. But I'll stop here and we will see what is coming from the audience in terms of questions, critiques, ideas. Michael, do we take 3-4 interventions at the same time?
I think we should, unless there's a pause and we only have 2, then we'll take 2. But right now we do have one from Peter, and there is another one from, we have 3 right away. Peter, then Michael Petrides, then Peruz. It's Peter, Peruz, then Michael. And go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Michael. So Marcello mentioned, by the way, thanks for that book, it's great. Marcello mentioned the curious fact to me that no one really picked up on Marx's discussion of alienation and capital for the first 70 years. Really, Althusser maybe, but almost no one. And I'm curious why that is, since there was lots of other writing about alienation, but no one seemed to reference capital in Marx's discussion of alienation. Is it because none of them had actually read it? Or was it because they didn't understand it, or that they were really talking about something entirely different that Marx was talking about? I mean, to me, it seemed, I've raised this before, is the popular conception among, sociologists and Weber and all these other people really is something entirely different, an alienation that is not at all related to what Marx is talking about? To me, it really isn't, because Marx really talked about production, the production process. So that's a question and a comment. Thanks.
Peruz, go ahead.
Thank you, Marcello, for your great presentation. I have not read your book, but based on your introduction, I'd like to make a comment and a question. I don't think it helps really to demarcate Marx's early writings with his later writings the way Althusser or you or others are doing it. And let me explain it why. I would say that we don't say Mozart's early works, his piano variations are less mature than his requiems, So that kind of juxtaposition for me doesn't matter who it is, it creates a problem. I'm not saying we should not make a comparison between what Marx is saying in the early manuscript versus what he is saying in Capital. I would add that Marx's theory of alienation seems to be not only in the early writings, a good part of it, but also in the Grundrisse, a good part of it, and then also in Capital. So I'm just going back to my first point again. Marx writes the Critique of Hegel when he is 25 years old. Nobody has come and said this work is immature. Let's compare it with some other work. Let's compare it with his French Revolution and Louis Bonaparte's work. So when we make the comparison, in the early writings we see, or in the German ideology, which is written in 1845, we see that alienation is the cause for private property. When we come to capital, we see the exact opposite. We see private property leading to alienation. Now, this is not just an equation of a comparison of causality or which one comes first. If you abolish private property, you have not abolished alienation, according to the early writings. That is huge in the writings of Marx. And to say also, to come to the concept of what is alienation in Grundriss, we just 2 hours before this class, we had a discussion over this issue, and it's a little bit fresh in my mind. Without taking too much time, there in Grundriss, Marx is discussing social substance, how that value is separated from use value, and how that value itself is social substance, and within that, how that ideality of being for itself is created. So the individual already in the form of the value is already embodied in the Grundriss writing, and alienation is there as he's talking about being for itself. So it's not an evolution in Marx. These are critical moments of his analysis. We do not come and say first comes finance capital, then industrial capital, and then circulation of capital. These are all different moments of capital. So I wonder, now my question is, do you agree with this demarcation of early, immature, and then the maturity aspect, which Althusser and others and yourself seems to be abiding, except that you give more emphasis to the latter part, the capital, as opposed to the 3,000 words maximum from the early writings? And what about this argument that I am putting forward, that in the German ideology, alienation comes before private property, that abolishment of private property, and therefore the issue is not just because he has brought it into the capital that he is becoming more and more concrete and better. Thank you.
Michael Petrides, your turn.
Michael, do you want to give the opportunity to Professor Musto to answer, because there are a lot of questions?
There is quite a bit now.
If he wants to answer, and afterwards we can ask more questions.
Marcello.
Please go ahead, Michael, and then Michael and I will have our response. But three is fine, thanks.
Okay, I would like to thank Professor Musto for the presentation that he made. I have just a few remarks on about this speech. The first one is a question. Why do you believe there is this misunderstanding and misconception in a lot of people in the academia that Marx abandons the notion of alienation after the decade of 40s? Do you believe that this is only and only because they do not read Marx, or there are other reasons to this? Also, I would like to suggest that a distinction between a young and a mature Marx is a little bit complicated also in terms of biographical reading of someone's life. And I would like here to mention the book that Michael Heinrich has published from Neue Marx-Lektur about the young Karl Marx and the birth of modernity, in order of how we read the young Marx's life. The third one is that I believe there is a misconception about how we read the work of Marx. We read the work of Marx as a philosophical left Hegelian idealist work, and afterwards as an economic commentary. But for Marx, his work on capital was never an economic commentary. It was a critique of political economy. It was not to present a right or just political economy. It was a philosophical critique of political economy, and with the notion of the critique that he has from classical German philosophy. And the last is that if you believe, and this is a question for both Professor Hardt and Professor Musto, if we can articulate an argument for many types of alienation, so it's not a substantiative or a essentialist approach to alienation with the capital A, but are many types of alienations. And I would like to ask here if we can find, and I believe we can, find a notion of alienation from not from human nature, as we have found in the Parisian manuscripts of 44, but from nature as a whole. Because there was a small remark from Professor Hardt about this, also in the commentary of Spinoza. If we can find this notion of alienation from nature as a whole in Marx. So these 3-4 small remarks, and thank you again for this presentation and also for the commentary of Professor Hardt.
Thank you very much. Michael Hardt, if you do not disagree, I will take a couple of these things, and then you can also say your word, of course, and I will leave a few of them to you so that we have more time to discuss with other people. The question of Peter, the first question of Peter and the first question of Michael, I believe that they are connected, and perhaps I will be able within a minute, one of my 3 minutes, because Michael Leonard told us that we have to be as short, as fast as possible so that we have more chance to discuss with as many of you as possible. They are connected, and perhaps I can clarify this. Why, Peter, there is no discussion for 100 years? Why I use this, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's idea of 100 years of solitude for the concept of alienation? And why Michael is asking there is this misunderstanding. They abandoned, they didn't understand, they didn't read Marx carefully, etc. So the answer to this is that the term of alienation cannot be found in Marx published works. In many of them, it is something that you find in very few places. Okay, so if you look at I'm going to share the table of contents, perhaps, of the book now in the chat. But in the Holy Family, there is a passage about alienation, less than a page. In Wage, Labor, and Capital, in the late 40s, there is something that might suggest something about alienation, and then there is nothing else, with the exception of these pages on fetishism, very important section that Michael Hardt discussed before me, that Marx published in 1867. So the reason is that there is nothing out there. When this unpublished manuscript, unfinished manuscript of Marx, belonging to different phases of his studies, and also this intellectual biography came out, then it was possible to have this huge discussion about alienation in Marxism. And as I try to say, this huge discussion in Marxism also became one of the most important philosophical or sociological discussion, because alienation was the concept in the 60s, in the 70s, like, I don't know, globalization was 20 years ago, something like this. And people try to explain everything with alienation, even though this had nothing to do or very little to do with Marx's conception of alienation, that is something related to alienated labor. So the answer to this is that there is nothing out there. And then there are these two generations of writings on alienation that I call the 1930s, but actually the circulation started in the early 50s, and then with the Grundrisse and with the other preparatory manuscript of Capital, a later series of texts in which there is a lot of alienation. I will leave to Michael Hardt the question about Althusser, mostly to Michael, but Pyrrhus, I was not able to explain myself, or I gave too much emphasis when I was interpreting Althusser. No, I do not agree this position, and actually I shared in the chat an article that I wrote a few years ago, The Meat of the Young Marx, in which you will find, my attempt to reconstruct this very huge, big discussion, and also to give my position. But if I criticize this, and we will hear Michael Hardt, and he will try to tell us the positive side of Althusser, I've always been very critical of him. I want to say that not only the first position is the most naive one, or the one that Marx, when he was just starting to flirt with the woman of his life, political economy, he was achieving the best and the highest point of his life, first. And second, also in the position of the continuity in which I located my interpretation, there are some problems, and I would like to overview them very briefly within 1 minute. So the idea of this continuum was the inspiration for some of the best, in my opinion, interpretation of alienation in Marx. However, there were a number of errors, most notably in certain authors who underestimate Marx's advances made in the 50s and in the 60s in terms of political economy, in his analysis of political economy. Number two, this went together with a diffuse tendency to reconstruct Marx's thought through collections of quotations without taking into account the different periods in which the source text had been written. So Michael Hardt told us about his students and the fact that he's teaching Marx in 20 years, and there is a lot of alienation, too much in my opinion, because Marx had done much more. I can tell you that out of 100 students, every time I ask a question and there is a final essay about alienation, they just do copy paste from what is online, and they say Marx alienation is 1, 2, 3, 4 from 1844 manuscript. So I wanted to balance this a little bit more, and I wanted to show them how rich is this interpretation that Marx is able to do after 15 years of work, also of political works that comes with, and after the Grundrisse. And then, so these other anthologies are unacceptable because they really locate the problem only there, and locating the problem there, they focus too much attention on this self-alienation, on this passive being, and all these philosophers that perhaps have read very few pages of Marx critique political economy. Many of them do not know Capital. All too often, the result was an author assembled out of pieces corresponding to interpret this particular vision, passing backwards and forwards between Capital and the EPM of 1844, as if Marx's work were a single and timeless and undifferentiated text. So this is my problem here, and this is why I did this anthology, basically. Michael, I'll leave the rest to you also, because there are some complicated things that I'm sure you will be able to deal much better than me. Thanks.
So I think I really just have one idea, but even before that, I mean, I think Michael is exactly right about the many different types of alienation, and I think that's interesting, and that we could even extend them, like you say, to alienation from nature. That's quite right. And what I was affirming in Althusser was not his results. It was simply the critique of humanism, which that part does make sense to me and seem right. Also the humanism in the young Marx, but I'm not so invested in that. What thinking, because all three of the questions and then Marcello too are quite invested on there not being a break. And perhaps I could accept that, but what doesn't, I think I'm less inclined than than I think several of you, at least, to see the political value of alienation. And so that's why what I was kind of indicating when I quoted from chapter 32 of volume 1, when Marx formulates the passage to communism in terms of the accomplishments of the capitalist era, it's not a break that I'm referring to here. What it really is, because we can see in the manifesto, Marx and Engels are also basing, they saying that capital, in the interest of its own development, necessarily gives weapons to the proletariat, necessarily creates the conditions of its own overthrow, it creates its own gravediggers. So we can see a direct line from that to the argument about communism proceeding from the accomplishments of the capitalist era. It seems to me alienation in contrast. I think this is, I'm trying to crystallize my misgivings, which are a little vague, is that alienation does not provide an argument for a passage to communism based on the accomplishments of the capitalist era. It is not about the way that capital in its own development gives weapons. Because alienation, this is maybe, I don't mean this, please don't take this as a criticism or a political opposition, but I don't yet see, and I haven't seen in the past, how alienation is useful politically, because, for instance, for me, the creation of an unalienated society, like, for instance, unalienated labor, fuck that, I don't want to have anything with that. It doesn't yet present to me what I understand its critique and its critical force, especially its moral force, but I don't see the political utility of it the way I do other arguments, and I'm just putting them under the rubric of accomplishments of the capitalist era, hoping that makes some sense to you all. I know I'm doing it in somewhat telegrammatic form, but I hope that makes sense. It responds diagonally, I think, to the three comments, if that makes sense.
Marcello, did you want to comment before we take more questions or move to more questions?
I will go to more questions, and later Michael and I will continue to discuss. I'm not in the by the way. Yeah.
Okay, Babak, you are next, and if there are more people who raise their hand or write stack, we'll take them as well. Go ahead, Babak.
Yeah, thank you for both presenters for presenting such thought-provoking and insightful comments. Just wanted to kind of react to some of the points that Professor Hardt brought up. I start from the last one. I think what makes alienation political, and I think Marcello's introduction really shows that vividly, is the fact that the evolution of the concept itself, not just remaining within Marx's own writing, which has its own complications and political aspects in his relation to others' conception of alienation that he was responding to. But then when you look at the history of the dissemination and reception of the concept itself, that becomes inherently a political discussion, right? Both in its absence and presence in the 30s and the 60s in relation to Soviet Union and the post-World War, Second World War transformations, that makes the concept itself and sort of the revival of that debate a political endeavor. And I think we have to be sensitive to not just, and I think what I appreciate from Marcello's introduction is precisely extending that concept beyond writings of Marx and the controversies within it, right? And extending it into the 20th century, which kind of, opens a question. I don't think it answers it. I wish we could have elaborated a little bit more on this, of the relevance of that concept for 21st century and the revival of that debate, like what that debate does for us politically in light of this long history, not just within Marx's concept writing, but also the 20th century. What I think is also fascinating in that discussion within Marx's own writing is that he had these kind of interlocutors that he was responding to in the early writings, obviously Feuerbach and Hegelians, but also, his moved to the economic categories through the reception of alienation within English political economies, which he had, he adopted aspects of it and then he was critical of it. But then that question remained a big, a puzzle for him. He didn't invoke the concept, but then he fundamentally, and I think I would like to know what Marcello thinks of this. He actually, and I think there is a reconciliation between, on that basis, between Michael Hardt and Musto on this, that I think Marx actually abandoned aspects of essentialism that his, reception of alienation, the early writings had, because of his relation with, or his interlocutor being Feuerbach and the left Hegelians, and that the kind of essentialism especially on the concept of labor that they maintain. And he then kind of moved to abstract labor, socially necessary labor time, which are much more anti-essentialist and abstract concepts that he couldn't really get at in the early writings because of his he was just starting to kind of elaborate on this. So anyway, I want to keep my comments short, but these are kind of, I think there is a reconciliation if Marcello accepts or agrees with this kind of move towards anti-essentialism while maintaining the puzzle of alienation. Then we can kind of conceptualize that alienation remain important for Marx, but in a much more anti-essentialist, complicated ways within his writing. Thank you.
So usually I do not take a second question from someone, but because no one else has their hands up, Michael Petrides has another comment. Are you ready, Michael?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. I have a last question for Professor Hardt that came in my mind when I heard his remarks about the Althusser position about the epistemological break. In my opinion, when we analyze this debate about if there is or if there is not an epistemological break in the work of Marx, we lose from our side a very important issue. I believe many Marxists feel a little bit offended that this position is remarking an abandonment of elements and that we have a division, a strict division between two persons, a young Marx and a mature Marx. But without supporting the thesis of Althusser, I believe that he's trying to show us in his work about Marx, for Marx, that is not an abandonment of elements, but is a creation of a new framework. In the foreword to the English readers, he insists that I believe Althusser said that event that is happening in 44 to 45, 46 is like how can he says it is the establishment of a new science. It's like Marx found a new continent, a new way to read history, and he makes some suggestion about Thales and the mathematics, etc. And I would like some comments on this, about if it is an abandonment of elements or Althusser is showing us that Marx really found a new framework of understanding history. Thank you.
1 minute. Peter, do you have a second question, or is your hand raised from the first time? You're okay. Okay.
Also, because people have second question, they must buy the book. You didn't say this, Michael, but Michael Hardt, can I just take 1 minute and then I give the floor to you? Because I wanted to say that, and also most of this was for you, I accept the bridge that Babak is trying to build, and I will agree of this question of, Marx abandoning aspect of essentialism, move to anti-essentialism. But I would like to convince you a little bit more using one thing that Babak mentioned and another one of the possible political implication. You said critique of moral force. perhaps also a little bit more, but of this concept of alienation. That in any case, I would say it is perhaps there are many other things about Marx, as you told us, also politically, and the fact that there has been so much alienation in the 20th century is also something that we should consider. So Babak said the critique of this concept, how important it was for, you know, Soviet society going against this interpretation, conception of socialism, and the fact that this book was dangerous. There is actually one other book of Marx, and this was really actually published by Marx when Marx was alive, that was not published in Russia, in Soviet Union, and it is the diplomatic history that Marx wrote in 1857. We are in times of war, and this is the book when Marx is writing against Russia completely, entirely, and if you change the word Russia and you put the word Soviet Union and you think about the invasion of 1956, 1968, it is something very dangerous. The Russian never published that. The first time that book published by Marx, written by Marx, came out was in 1983 in an English translation of the Marx Engels collected works. But I want to go to the question of the political dimension of alienation. And I try to make a case in the introduction that this preparatory manuscript of capitalism were not only provided a coherent theoretical basis for the new studies in alienation, but above all, an anti-capitalist ideological platform for the extraordinary political and social movement that, you know, existed in those years, the 60s, the 70s. So alienation left the book of philosophers and the lecture halls of university and took the streets and became a sort of, you know, a good tool, an important instrument for the critique of bourgeois society in general. So from that point of view, I see that there is a political use of the concept. But Michael, all for you.
I was just interested in how Michael and Babak's comments fit together, like very nicely. And both of them, I mean, the questioning, I mean, I think just both of you, I feel, are making more subtle the question about break that obviously Althusser does in a brutal and polemical way for his own interests at the time. But the way both of you were posing this, even the ambiguities about it, seemed quite interesting to me and useful. So I feel like I really don't have anything to add to those two. Just seemed like very interesting interventions. And in the chat, the very interesting quote we got about that, which is great. Yeah, Marcello, this might be the topic for for your to be continued in your next Zoom presentation about the. I mean, of course, I recognize how there's a political meaning to alienation and even the imagination of an unalienated society, but that doesn't mean for me necessarily the political utility of it. I mean, what I find most useful, the version of Marx's argument I find most useful is one that regards the developments of capitalist society as a kind of launch pad, as an opportunity to build the new society within the shell of the old, this type of thing. And so I find less useful politically the elements of either Marx's own thought or Marxism, different Marxisms that pose a completely valid rejection of capital, and it's those elements that don't have for me the same political movement towards the future, something like that. And so that's where I still am with alienation. It could be I'm in the process of learning, and in our next conversation I'll become more intelligent and be won over to your side.
Michael, thank you very much. It was very, very useful for me, and I learned a lot from this, from what you write. So it was great. Thanks, and thanks also to Michael. Michael, would you like to say something else? Michael Landner?
Hey, Well, because no one is stacking or chatting, there is, or raising their hands, I feel like this discussion has been very comprehensive, but there's so much more to go through. What I will say is that in the chat over here, I put a link to our reading group that is, we began an introduction last Monday, but the group really begins this Monday night, and we at the Marxist Education Project do close readings with discussion, and it's a very unalienated way for a group of people to absorb very complex ideas, because there is always someone who can parse out what others don't understand, and there is something about the non-alienated aspect of collective learning that doesn't have the pressure of heavy debt being put on one for the studies and such. At the MEP, if you can't afford our fees, you just ask and you come in free. But however, we have Tara Needham, who has just stacked, and I don't want to not hear what she has to say. So Tara, you are up for your question and comment. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I'm late to the party here, and thank you to all of the Michaels who are presenting, and Marcello. This has been wonderful. I guess I just want to put a little more pressure on this, what's seeming to be the kind of arc that the conversation has moved to, the political valence of alienation. And, you know, I was interested in Michael Hardt's comment about this being the concept that resonates always and most with his students. So I'm wondering about its utility, not just for university workers or for thinkers, but for workers as a form of sort of identification and consciousness raising. I mean, it seems to me that it has so much purchase because people see their lives in this concept, you know, in its most sophisticated and in its most kind of maybe vulgar senses, right? If I'm alienated from my labor, it does give me language to express, you know, my subject position in the monstrous, enormous world of capital. And also, it's interesting to think of service workers, right, whose, you know, labor is so entrenched with other people that alienation, I think, has more of a resonance. So I guess this is less of a question. I guess I am, and then I was also interested in Michael Hardt's invocation of the idea of the moral as opposed to the political, that, you know, what is that line between the kind of moral address to the worker that then has a kind of political consequence. And I apologize if this is just restating basically where we've already landed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. So, Michael or Marcello, who would begin?
Oh, I'm fine with this. As Tara said, this is just a contribution. I don't know if Michael wants to say something else. I'm fine.
Well,
no, I thought it also is a very useful, contribution. When I definitely think Tara's right about the not just pedagogical utility of the concept, like you say, for workers recognizing their own condition and what can be different. Yeah, pedagogical was probably not the right word, but the utility as a perspective or something like that. That totally makes sense to me, and maybe I would need to revise what I said earlier. Maybe I wasn't saying it quite right about the political utility of the concept because I said something sort of different in mind. But I'll keep thinking about that. We don't always, one doesn't always get these things exactly right, saying them the first time. Or I don't, at least. I don't know, maybe other people do. But I think that was really helpful.
Perez, you have another comment, question, and I think this will be our last comment question, and we'll see where we go from there. Go ahead, Peruz.
I was just going to say that I found Michael Hardt's point on political utility stunning, really. And I'm just stunned that it is reduced to political utility. I think the concept of alienation should also be taken outside of the production, outside of the really the production process itself. A person could be totally alienated in any organization, in any association, on the basis of what goes on. Among it would be religious institutions.
So, okay. I would just like to say that when you read through the introduction that Marcello did, you get a very broad expression of what Marcello says about Marx from the time he began his work and all his writings, but the waves of considering alienation following the experience of full industrialization and subsumption of our class, etc., is and how it has continued as areas of where people say have an entry point to their analysis of capitalism, which does happen through the alienation effect of living in a capitalist world. It's a great introduction, and I encourage all of you to go to the internet, find this book, and get it. It's a great companion for your studies of Marx, your critique of capital, etc. And anyone who would like, tomorrow I gave many of you the link, the Zoom link for tomorrow's presentation. And Michael, I'm glad you, in a way, did a subtle promotion of next week's presentation on Spinoza and Marx with Jason Reed. Thank you so much. And I very much appreciate you, Marcello, you, Michael, and everyone who showed up today. This is all how we get a broad movement going intellectually and politically, etc. I would like everyone to know we had people from around the globe today. We had Huang from the north of Vietnam. We had people from Indonesia, New Zealand, South Africa, and just all over the place. And I appreciate all of you showing up on what has been here in New York, a pretty decent afternoon to get out after that dreary winter we just got through. Great applause for Marcello, Michael, and all who came in. And let's do this again.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael Hardt, for your insightful comments. It was a pleasure. We'll continue the discussion soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all.